they'll never know who my father is. That's the part that hurts the most.
She was awakened by her husband screaming out her name, and he was on fire.
Revenge is based on an unsatisfied feeling within yourself. I need you to feel what I feel. And the only way that I can get you to feel what I feel is to hurt you.
You just keep hurting each other, hurting each other, hurting each other.
You have to be able to control that impulse that's inside of you. And if not, this is the result. In Norwalk, Connecticut, 911 operators received a frantic call that there was a fire.
When the paramedics and police got there, they found something a little strange, something completely different from what they expected.
Rather than a house engulfed in flames, they find a man struggling to back out of the driveway.
The victim was observed operating his vehicle, trying to take himself to the hospital. He was in a lot of pain and in shock.
He was severely burned over the upper torso of his body. The police didn't understand how this man was even functioning at this point.
The burns were terrible. You know, they were from his chest all the way to his knees.
He seemed to be delirious and incoherent, but what they could clearly make out, that he said he woke up and he was on fire.
The first priority is going to be to take care of the victim and make sure the victim gets medical attention and gets to the hospital.
As first responders attend to the man, 3 other people emerge, explaining there's no active fire inside. One identifies herself as Mary Ann Langley. She says the victim is her husband, 55-year-old James Langley. The people with her are her niece and nephew, who live next door with Mary Ann's sister. All 3 are shaken, unsure of what happened, and worried about James.
James Langley was born and raised in Farmville, North Carolina. He was a typical Southern young man. He grew up riding his bike, fishing. He was one of 8 siblings.
My brother James, he was a nice guy. He was competitive. Anything he was doing, he wanted to be competitive. He and I used to do everything against each other, if you want to look at it that way, and laugh about it afterwards.
James and his brothers learned at an early age that the way to get what you want in life is to work hard.
As a child, we would get up, 5:30 in the morning, work 12 hours a day. We knew how to run any kind of machinery or tractors and animals or whatever the case may be. We could do it, We were used to working and working hard.
In the late 1960s, James's older brother, Willie, moved to Connecticut, seeking new opportunities.
My father and them, they seen how my uncle was doing, and when he was coming back with the cars and the nice clothes, and he said he wanted to leave and come live with my Uncle Willie so he can make a better life for himself.
James came from North Carolina probably in our junior high school years. James was a country boy at heart, very likable character, full of life. We did car racing together, illegal drag strip racing, and then that plus our time in school and young ladies that we were involved in at the time, we became pretty close friends.
At 18, James got married to his high school sweetheart and went to work for the Connecticut Department of Transportation.
My father married my mother, Barbara Coleman, when she was 18. My father worked at the Department of Transportation. He started off cutting grass and getting roads ready when they were cracked up, putting the seal in the cracks. And then he moved up to be the foreman.
James had 2 sons. That would be James Corey Jr. and Terrence. And they were basically less than a year apart.
Unfortunately, James's dedication to work didn't leave room for much else.
He would work from sunup probably to sundown, and then, his wife would be angry. He'd come home and just flop down on the living room floor to watch TV, and that would be the end of his day. And she'd be yelling around the house, you're out there, you're doing too much. And he eventually got divorced after about maybe 7 or 8 years, and he moved on.
James was determined to be a great father, and he made sure his boys stayed very close to him.
Though James had been divorced once, he never gave up on love. One day, at his son's Little League game, he met Mary Ann Stokes.
Mary Ann was from the South originally. She was a kind-hearted lady. She was a churchgoer and family-oriented.
Mary Ann had a relationship. She got married, and through that marriage, she had a son named Daryl. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't work out for her. So meeting someone like James was pretty something she was ready for.
He had just gone through a divorce, and he was going through some things of his own, I guess, with being alone. They just became a couple, and it worked out, and they went together for quite a while.
In 1981, Mary Ann and James decided to get married. So the blended family, her one son, his 2 sons, they all became one cohesive group.
Mrs. Langley really loved her husband. She loved him very much. She cooked for him. She cleaned for him. He was a diabetic, and she really took care of him.
He was a great cook, and if you went in that house, there was food within arm reach anytime you went there. They were big eaters. We were country people. We all were country people, and we all cooked. So we did it big, I tell you.
Family life was going well, but James realized his hard work wasn't being recognized at the Department of Transportation.
After a number of years of being passed over for promotions, James decided to start his own landscaping and paving business in 1988.
James was extremely competitive. He wanted to win at everything he did. So when it came time for him to open up his own business, he went full force. The same way he put in that work for other people, he decided to put the work in for himself.
James enjoyed being his own boss and providing Mary Ann with a comfortable life. But most importantly, he wanted to set a good example for his sons.
He would have his children work with him. He would take them out on jobs with him, show them how it's done, so later on that they could, be enterprising young men themselves.
Most of the time he wanted us to be out there working when we was, instead of out in the street having a good time. He tried to plant a seed that you gotta work for you. In order to get what you want in life, you're gonna have to get up and you're gonna go to work and go get it.
Because the business was flourishing so well, James was able to invest in real estate properties. He had rental properties, commercial properties.
He wanted to get bigger, and he had other dreams of selling out later on to stockpile finances so that he would be comfortable.
It resulted in a quite comfortable lifestyle. By the time they had reached their late 40s, they had amassed an estate worth well over $1 million.
On December 4th, 2006, James celebrated his 55th birthday and finally started thinking about retirement.
He was rambling on about leaving and going to move, sell everything, or take the equipment and I should just move back to North Carolina. So I said, well, if that's what you want to do, then let's do that. Let's just pick up and go.
Now, it seems he may never get the chance. 10 days after his birthday, James is rushed to the emergency room, suffering from severe burns.
The police went and checked on the house to make sure there's no other victims and that the fire was, in fact, which it had been, put out. And upon their entering into the residence, they detected a strong odor of gasoline.
While doctors struggled to stabilize James Langley at a Norwalk, Connecticut hospital, Detectives speak with his wife, Mary Ann, to find out what happened.
When the investigators initially interviewed Mary Ann, she was quite distraught. Mary Ann said she had fell asleep in the basement and she was awakened by her husband screaming out her name.
She said that she saw the kitchen light off and the sparkling of fire.
She was terrified and unsure what to do.
She panicked and ran next door to her sister's house and began frantically banging on the door to try to get some assistance, and that's when they called the police and the ambulance.
She really did not offer any explanation as to how what happened to James could have happened.
Authorities combed the house for evidence, led by Fire Inspector John Lumba. For him, this is no ordinary investigation. He has a personal connection to the victim.
The case was very difficult for me, basically because it involved human life, and it involved a friend that I had known for many, many years. But I couldn't allow that to, sway an opinion or anything. It went strictly by evidence.
It was apparent that the fire was contained to one area of the house.
Investigators, upon looking into the master bedroom, they see that there's burn patterns on the carpet.
There were droplets of burn patterns, but it wasn't a consistent burn. It wasn't a big pattern burn. It was just droplets that had ignited at some point and it went out. And you could say they were droplets because they were very small. They looked like teardrops on the flooring.
One of the odd things was there was no fire on the bed at all. Nothing on the bed was singed or burned.
The fact that the bed itself wasn't half burnt would indicate that James was not asleep in bed when the fire occurred.
But the fire investigator found that odd because James had mentioned earlier that he woke up on fire, and they thought that how could he do that if there were no burn marks there?
The next thing you look for is the ignition source. What caused the heat buildup to create a fire? So you're looking for wiring, you're looking for a candle or something like that. James was not a smoker. There was no cigarettes, there was no lighter. Where the fire was, there was no ignition sources.
So was this an accident or something more sinister? Investigators find more clues in the kitchen.
There's matches, a pack of matches with a single burnt match on the edge of the counter.
I couldn't absolutely say that that was used to ignite because sometimes when you have a gas stove, which they did at the time, sometimes when you have a bad pilot light or a bad burner, people use a match to ignite that burner to continue their cooking.
Also found in the garbage can in the kitchen was a solid, heavy plastic cup. It was lying right on top of the garbage in the garbage can, which would indicate that it was relatively freshly put there. Also, it had a strong odor of residue gasoline in it, which is what you're smelling throughout the house. So it would kind of be indicative that that was used to transport the gasoline.
They find a similar piece of evidence left just outside the back door.
On the top of the garbage can, there was a white styrofoam coffee cup that had the bottom had been disintegrated. And that's what happens when you pour something with acetone, gasoline, or acid in styrofoam.
When I saw the melted cup, I kind of recognized what was going on. Gasoline will go through a styrofoam cup probably in about 30 seconds.
If someone filled the cup with gas outside, it wouldn't have lasted long.
By the time you got back to the house, you'd have basically a burnt-through cup, which would explain why it was discarded.
Evidence seems to point that James Langley had been intentionally set on fire, but there was no evidence of any forced entry into the home. So the question really is, who struck the match?
The morning after a fire gravely injures James Langley, investigators still have more questions than answers. So they ask his wife, Mary Ann, to come in for another interview.
The first time they talked to her, she was very distraught. This time she came in pretty calm.
This time, when they asked her, did she have any idea how did this all come about? She said she did.
Mary Ann began to tell them that James had been diagnosed with type 2 adult diabetes, and he wasn't really taking care of himself, according to her. She wasn't taking his meds, and that might have led to what had happened.
Why don't you start with last evening and go through again what happened?
In my interview with Mary Ann Langley, she related that at around 8:30, they started slumping and also had urinated on himself, which she knew or believed to be diabetic in nature.
I said, your sugar must be up real high. I said, Langley, I said, I'm gonna take it. So I did. And I said, Langley, your sugar's 594. And then I said to him, listen, you gotta go to the hospital.
After some convincing, they decided to go. Once they arrived at the hospital, the emergency room was a little crowded, and James decided he wasn't going to get out the car. He didn't want to be involved in all the people that were there. So James insisted that Mary Ann drive him home.
He was still not doing well and had a hard time taking off his clothes.
She was very upset with him, and they argued a little more about James not taking care of himself. At that point is when she decided she was going to sleep downstairs because she just couldn't reason with the man.
Mary Ann says she fell asleep in the basement bedroom. Shortly before 5 a.m., she woke up to the sound of her husband shouting.
I hear him screaming for me. I was screaming. I said, what? I went running. I said, what? Oh, God, when I see this bucket of the fire, I ran out the door. And I run to my sister's back door, screaming.
She didn't see the fire start, but she thinks she knows what happened.
Mary Ann said that she believes that James woke up in a disoriented stupor and probably set himself on fire. James had frequently come home with the smell of gasoline on his clothes from different jobs that they do. So the gasoline being on him is not too far-fetched. Because of the condition that people suffer from being in a diabetic haze when your numbers are so high, the detectives had to at least consider James setting himself on fire was a possibility.
Mary Ann says that after calling 911 from next door, she returned with her niece and nephew and found James delirious and making wild accusations.
I asked her, well, what was he saying? She basically, well, he was hallucinating, he was crazy, he didn't know what he was talking about. And when I asked her, well, what was he saying? She said, well, he said that I lit him on fire, which wasn't true.
Mary Ann couldn't believe that he accused her of something of that nature. Why would Mary Ann spend her time taking him to the hospital, arguing with him, trying to convince him to take better care of himself if she was just going to turn around and set him on fire?
He was hallucinating, you know. What, you trying to kill me? I said, what are you talking about? I was, crying and screaming, and it was terrible. It was terrible.
If somebody goes into shock, is it very possible that they're not aware of the here and now conversation and their thought patterns? Yes.
If Mary Ann had harmed James, why would she volunteer the detail of James's accusation? Investigators also ask her about the matches and cups they found.
She explained that she uses matches to light the pilot on the stove when it doesn't work automatically, and that's why that was there. The thick plastic cup, she said it was a daily use cup.
Are your fingerprints going to come back on that cup?
Oh, yeah, I use the cup all the time. That cup was in the sink last night, okay? That cup.
Marianne said they used the styrofoam cups for their daily coffee, but she doesn't know why it would end up in the back door unless James did it.
My brother knows not to set himself on fire. I mean, it can happen, but he dealt with stuff like that every day. He dealt with diesel fuel, gasoline, all kinds of oils.
It was very difficult for me to believe that my father would go get gasoline and set himself on fire.
Only one person knows exactly what happened, and unfortunately, he's lying in a hospital room, unconscious.
He had burns, reportedly about 40% of his body, on his abdomen, backs of the arms, hands, and they were second and third degree burns, which are very serious.
When I went to the hospital to see him, they had sedated him so that he wouldn't hurt himself because he would get delirious, in his sleep from the burns and so forth and so on.
They had to take him to surgery and do the skin graft. It was maybe a 50-50, 60-40 chance that he lived, so I just could take that answer, and there was nothing I could do. And my father's sitting in the hospital going through the pain that he going through, and I might not have my father back again. So that was the hardest part.
In the days following James Langley's hospitalization, Norwalk police interview the rest of his family, starting with his niece and nephew who lived next door.
During the interviews with both of them, they reiterated what Marianne Langley in her interview had alluded to, which is that James was accusing her of lighting him on fire.
He says words to the effect that, "I know who did this to me. It was your aunt. She did this to me. She poured the liquid and she lit the match."
They tried to explain to him that the ambulance was already on its way and the police had been called. But he was so out of it that he just kind of ran out the door, got into the car, and tried to drive himself.
The niece and nephew's story strengthens the theory that James was delirious. James's other statement that night suggests more confusion.
He'd already indicated to the police that he woke up and he was on fire. And it's sort of hard to reconcile the fact that somebody can observe his wife pouring liquid on him and lighting a match when he was asleep.
Authorities asked the niece and nephew about the couple's relationship and get some surprising information.
James and Marianne had continued marital problems. In fact, it was common knowledge that James had an ongoing affair.
The affair began in 2004 when James was hired to build a wall on the property of a woman named Sylvia.
She came over to start speaking to James about it, and one thing led to another, and they became very interested in each other very quickly. She put some light back into his life that he had lost in his marriage, and the relationship quickly escalated into something romantic.
Understandably, Marianne was very upset when she learned of the affair.
I know that Marianne somehow got wind of this particular relationship, and she went in the driveway with the van, and the wall was there that he had built, and she kind of rammed the wall with the van. Things just got worse after that.
It turns out the relationship with Sylvia was just one of many affairs James had over the years, and the infidelity set off a vicious cycle in their relationship.
He wasn't happy at home, and so, he ran around. He ran around and she would catch him. And every time she would catch him, they go through a thing for a minute, and then they go stay together. I did hear her rumblings, but she was upset when I come around. I'm gonna leave your father. Okay, fine. If you're gonna leave him, okay, fine. There's nothing I can do about it.
About a year before the fire, Mary Ann got fed up. She had had enough. She decided to file for divorce from James.
But within a few months of Mary Ann trying to file for divorce, she dropped the divorce proceedings, and when Mary Ann came back and said no, she wants to work it out with her husband.
On December 20th, 6 days after James went into the hospital, investigators interviewed James's mistress, Sylvia, to get her side of the story.
She said that James had been unhappy in his marriage for a while, and when they met, she happened to give him a safe space to come when his married life was more turmoil.
Sylvia details what she thinks started that turmoil.
She explained to the investigators that money was really the source of their marital problems.
Mary Ann was a kept woman, and kept women are scary because when they're put in a situation where they might lose their lifestyle, they get desperate. They just weren't happy with each other, but he was holding out, she wanted more, and it was like, money is not a big deal if you're not happy.
But there's more to Sylvia's story about Mary Ann.
She's a heavy gambler, too.
Because of Mary Ann's gambling, James decided to cut her off from the joint bank account. That led to money mysteriously ended up missing from around the house, from the office. This became a serious problem for James.
It was a repetitive cycle. One goes and does something, and the other one feels like they're gonna do something to hurt the other one.
That was, I think, the final straw that made him make his decision that now was the time. I'm through with it, with the relationship.
According to her, James and her felt a sense of relief when Mary Ann finally filed for divorce. They thought it was over, that he would be finally done with her. But then she withdrew the case, and things went back to exactly the way they were before. The reason that Mary Ann stayed in the marriage is because she knew she would be better off financially staying with James than leaving him.
Sylvia explains that James had gotten Mary Ann to sign a prenuptial agreement.
If a divorce went down, she, because of the prenuptial, wouldn't have access to the business.
Sylvia also offers another crucial piece of information, something James said less than 48 hours before he was burned.
Let me ask you this, coming into Christmas, was there any indication or pressure or anything said to him that you...
The only thing coming into Christmas that he had said to me, and I don't know what it meant, was, oh, yeah, I know you don't think I'm doing anything, but you're going to be real surprised. And I just looked at him and said, whatever, because I've been listening to this for 2 years and I ain't seen nothing yet, as far as him getting a divorce.
This is a huge revelation for the investigators because this meant that Mary Ann now had a motive to commit murder.
After James Langley was set on fire, the results of an analysis of the burns on his body provide an important piece of the puzzle. The burns suggest whoever threw the gasoline on James was aiming for his genital area.
The pattern that was on James was more or less, he was protecting himself by putting his hands and arms down to protect his genitalia. That's why the burn pattern is on the back of his hands and his arms.
It was indicative that he was standing and that gasoline was thrown at him.
So the question that needs to be asked is, did Mary Ann intentionally set James on fire as payback for his affair?
Investigators think she did, and they believe the styrofoam cup left outside was part of a first attempt to do so. When the gas ate through the styrofoam, she switched to plastic to finish the deed. On December 22, 2006, 8 days after James's attack, Norwalk police once again questioned Mary Ann Langley.
There's a lot of things that when we discussed things on Saturday, there's a lot of things that turned out that you told me that I, to be honest with you, have reason to question the validity of it, okay? And yeah. I asked you how the marriage was going and were there any problems or anything else, and you answered me, no. I said, is he seeing any other women? I don't think there's any other...
I said I didn't know.
Well, you did know, because you went over her house.
I hadn't been over to her house in years.
Mary Ann agrees to take a polygraph test to prove her innocence, but the results are inconclusive. The police officers have no choice but to let her go home.
Investigators' best hope for finding out what really happened is to speak with the victim, James Langley. But 12 days after the incident, that hope is dashed.
I got a phone call. I need to get to the hospital. I hear Ann crying in the background. So I got in the car and I flew to Bridgeport Hospital. We just stood in the room over top of him for a long time, just staring.
James passed away on December 26th at night. He went into cardiac arrest, and they fought furiously to save him. And, I waited out in the hallway, and they was unable to save him.
That was the tough point. They just told me that, he fought as long as he could. That happened the day after Christmas. Christmas will never be the same for me. I try to make it the same, but it just won't never be the same.
The ruling of the autopsy was that it was a homicide based on the burn patterns and the severity of the burns, the location of the burns.
That's when the investigation really went into full force. I didn't want to think it was Ann. I think being around her for 25 years or so, it didn't dawn on me that she could have did such a thing as they were saying that could have happened,
There was only two people in the house, her and my father. So at the end of the day, that's the only two people that know exactly what happened that night. I really believe is that she just wanted to hurt him because he'd been hurting her.
Corey has no proof, but in the days following his father's death, he does tell investigators about some suspicious things Mary Ann has done with the family business.
She tells me there is no money, but that's a lie because I just gave her a check for $3,000.
But she's not paying you.
She hasn't paid, she's paid me once since my father's been gone.
Mary Ann wasn't explaining at all where any of the money was going.
We had a rock wall job going and a landscape job going. And next thing you know, we got a phone call saying to bring the bulldozer back. So I was like, what's going on? I'm asking questions. This is Mary Ann says, you gotta bring all of the machines back to the yard. And she sold the dump truck.
He also indicated that Mary Ann was trying to sell off both the business and the vehicles to the business.
In the prenup, she got nothing to do with J&L lawsuit.
She never did run the business. She just proceeded to sell off assets.
Investigators believe that she killed James in order to get control of the money and to get back at him for having an affair. On March 29, 2007, the police finally come knocking on Mary Ann's door and arrest her for James's murder.
She was aware that she was a suspect and going to be arrested. We arrested Mary Ann Langley at her home without incident. She was taken into custody, brought to headquarters.
But some fear it won't be quite as easy to get a conviction.
This case is not a simple open and shut case. Hey, somebody poured gasoline on their husband and lit him on fire. There are a lot of things that need to be focused on a lot more carefully.
On October 6, 2008, nearly 2 years after the death of James Langley, his wife, Mary Ann Langley, goes on trial for his murder.
Prosecutors framed the case where Mary Ann was this vindictive woman who was seeking revenge on her husband for cutting her out of the finances, and also leaving her for another woman.
This all began, they say, because James told her that morning that he was leaving to retire to North Carolina, but not with her, but with another woman. They argue that because Marianne would not have gotten any of the money based on the prenup, James leaving Marianne would have left her destitute, and that enraged her.
Prosecutors argue that, over the course of 2 decades, Marianne Langley had grown used to an increasingly lavish lifestyle. When James threatened to take that away and give it to another woman, she decided to take her revenge.
And the fact that it seemingly threw the gasoline towards his genitalia speaks volumes.
The defense presents a different theory, based on Marianne's initial statement.
There wasn't any magic science behind this. It was gasoline that clearly was the accelerant in this case. The question has always been, how did it ignite? Who set him on fire? One of the main aspects of the defense was James Langley probably did this to himself. It was an accidental burning, and there was evidence to suggest that. James Langley's condition lent itself to the possibility that he actually poured gasoline in the cup so that he could drink it. And while that sounds a little far-fetched, we had an expert witness, an endocrinologist, testify that his condition, which was such that one of the symptoms that he would have exhibited was a massive thirst. When she was asked on the stand whether or not somebody in Mr. James Langley's condition would drink gasoline, she said they would.
On October 20th, 2008, the question of what happened to James Langley is put to the jury.
Murder would be planned with intent to cause the death of somebody, and deliberate action, executing that plan with premeditation and intent. Manslaughter would be that your actions inadvertently caused the death of another person, but you caused the death.
The jury finds Marianne Langley not guilty of murder, but they do find her guilty on a lesser charge of first-degree manslaughter.
Once you take gasoline and you throw it on somebody and you light a match, there's only one intention at that point in time for me, because you could try to kill somebody. She just wanted to hurt him for all the hurt, the pain he put her through.
Marianne Langley initially faces 12 years in prison, but her sentence is contingent on one condition.
At this point, she was supposed to give an apology to the family. However, she was very arrogant with her apology. It really wasn't an apology at all. And I think basically the judge switched his decision right at that point and gave her the maximum, which was 20 years.
I think the ugliest part of this whole case is the revenge factor. We've all known women who have been scorned. We've all had breakups. We've all been through this before. Do we all go out and try to kill our partners? No. So at some point, you have to be able to control that childish impulse that's inside of you. And if not, this is the result.
It's okay to be upset about something. It's okay to hurt, but sit in it, figure out where it's...
Most serial killers leave behind a trail of bodies. Peter Tobin left behind something far more unsettling. He left behind questions. Questions buried beneath floorboards. Questions hidden under gardens that had long since grown green again. Questions that lingered inside police archives, gathering dust for decades while families waited for a phone call that never came. And perhaps the most disturbing question of all was this: if investigators had uncovered 3 victims by accident, how many more had simply never been found? In October 2006, detectives in Scotland believed they had solved a brutal murder. A young woman had disappeared after working inside a church. Days later, her body was discovered concealed beneath the floor of the very building where she had trusted she was safe. The suspect was a quiet maintenance worker with a long criminal history, a man whose aging face revealed little emotion when confronted with overwhelming evidence. His name was Peter Tobin. To most people, the case appeared finished. A murderer had been identified. Justice would follow. Newspapers printed the headlines. Television crews packed away their cameras. Public attention slowly drifted elsewhere. The detectives did not. Something about Tobin resisted the neat ending everyone wanted. Experienced investigators often describe a feeling they cannot immediately explain, an instinct shaped by years of studying violence. It is not supernatural. It is pattern recognition. Small inconsistencies begin connecting with one another until they form an image that refuses to disappear. Peter Tobin had lived an unusually restless life. Over 4 decades, he drifted across Britain like a shadow that never settled in one place for very long. Scotland, England, small towns, busy cities, temporary jobs, new addresses, new names, failed marriages, broken relationships. Every move seemed to erase part of his past before anyone could fully understand it. To an ordinary observer, that history looked chaotic. To homicide detectives, it looked familiar. Predatory offenders often survive by disappearing into ordinary life. They become neighbors whose names are quickly forgotten after they move away. They work jobs that require little scrutiny. They avoid attention until attention becomes impossible to escape. As investigators reconstructed Tobin's movements, another unsettling realization emerged. His timeline crossed paths with an alarming number of missing women. Sometimes the overlap was only geographic. Sometimes it was only chronological. Sometimes it was both. None of those coincidences proved murder. But there were simply too many coincidences to ignore. The murder of Angelica Cluck had cracked open a door that could no longer be closed. Detectives began asking a question few investigations ever require. What if this crime scene was not the beginning of Peter Tobin's story? What if it was the ending? That possibility transformed a single homicide investigation into one of the largest inquiries ever focused on an individual suspect in British criminal history. Its name was Operation Anagram. The title sounded almost harmless, almost administrative, as though it belonged to stacks of paperwork inside a government office. In reality, it represented thousands upon thousands of investigative hours, hundreds of officers, decades of forgotten records, and families who had spent years balancing fragile hope against unbearable uncertainty. Every old address mattered. Every previous employer mattered. Every prison record mattered. Every woman who had vanished near one of Tobin's homes suddenly mattered again. Investigators began reopening files that many believed would never again leave storage shelves. Yellowed photographs were examined under brighter lights than they had seen in years. Witness statements were read by detectives who had not even joined the police force when those interviews were first conducted. Maps were spread across conference tables as officers traced Tobin's movements across Britain year after year, searching for intersections between his life and lives that had suddenly ended without explanation. What they discovered would challenge assumptions that had remained untouched for decades. Some families received unexpected visits from detectives who quietly explained that an old investigation was being reviewed. Imagine answering your front door after 15 years, 20 years, perhaps even longer, only to hear someone say that the disappearance of your daughter had not been forgotten after all. Hope can be a cruel thing. For some parents, it returned after they had finally learned to live without it. Others feared the opposite. They feared that answers, if they ever arrived, would be far worse than uncertainty. Across Britain, Journalists began asking whether Peter Tobin might be responsible for crimes reaching back into the 1970s. Television documentaries compared timelines. Crime reporters revisited forgotten disappearances. Public speculation spread rapidly, fueled by one uncomfortable reality. Nobody seemed to know where Peter Tobin had been during many periods of his life. And when investigators cannot account for a violent offender's movements, every unsolved case begins demanding another look. There were whispers of victims no one had identified. Whispers of gardens yet to be excavated. Whispers of missing women whose names had almost disappeared from public memory. Then came an even more astonishing theory. Some investigators and criminal profilers quietly considered whether Peter Tobin could be connected to one of Scotland's greatest criminal mysteries, a phantom whose identity had haunted detectives for generations. The name carried almost mythical weight. Bible John. 3 murders. Countless theories. No conviction. No confirmed identity. Could the quiet maintenance worker arrested in 2006 somehow be the same predator who had terrorized Glasgow decades earlier? The similarities were intriguing enough to demand investigation. But similarity is not proof. And in criminal investigations, assumptions can be as dangerous as ignorance. Operation Anagram would become an extraordinary exercise in patience, skepticism, and relentless detail. Detectives understood that they were walking a narrow line. Every new possibility carried the risk of creating false hope. Every coincidence demanded careful testing rather than emotional conclusions. They were not searching for stories that fit a theory. They were searching for evidence strong enough to survive a courtroom. Because in the end, no matter how frightening the suspicion, only facts could speak for the dead. The first days of Operation Anagram did not begin with dramatic discoveries or televised announcements. They began in rooms filled with silence, where detectives sat before mountains of paper that seemed almost impossible to conquer. Long before digital databases connected police forces with a few keystrokes, investigations had lived inside filing cabinets, cardboard archive boxes, handwritten notebooks, fading photographs, and cassette recordings whose labels had begun to peel with age. Every document represented someone's worst day. Every folder carried a name that a family had whispered for years without receiving an answer. The officers assigned to the operation understood that they were not simply reviewing old crimes. They were challenging conclusions that had survived for decades. Every assumption made by previous investigators would have to be questioned. Every timeline would have to be rebuilt. Every address connected to Peter Tobin would have to be placed beside every known disappearance that had occurred within reach of his movements. The work was exhausting before it was even hopeful. A map of Britain slowly became something entirely different. At first glance, it was an ordinary collection of counties, highways, coastal towns, and crowded cities. But as investigators pinned Tobin's known residences across the landscape, patterns began to emerge. Glasgow. Bathgate, Margate, Havant, Brighton, London, Aberdeen. Places where he had lived for months. Places where he had stayed only briefly. Temporary jobs. Construction work. Maintenance positions. Rental properties. Boarding houses. Homes shared with wives who would later describe lives marked by fear and control. Each location represented another chapter in a life that had never remained still. Movement, detectives knew, could mean many things. People relocate every day for work, for family, for opportunity. Constant movement alone proves nothing. Yet experienced investigators also recognized another possibility. For certain offenders, moving was not merely practical. It was protective. A fresh town meant unfamiliar neighbors. New employers asked fewer questions. Old rumors stayed behind. If suspicions ever arose, the individual could disappear before anyone connected one identity to another. The challenge facing Operation Anagram was distinguishing coincidence from criminality. That distinction would define every decision they made. As officers reconstructed Tobin's life year by year, they discovered just how difficult that task would become. Records were incomplete. Addresses conflicted. Some dates overlapped while others simply vanished into uncertainty. Witnesses remembered events differently after decades had passed. Human memory, investigators knew, was fragile. People rarely recalled ordinary Tuesdays from 20 years earlier. They remembered birthdays, funerals, weddings, and disasters. Everything else blurred into a fog where certainty became dangerous. Still, fragments accumulated. One landlord remembered a quiet tenant who kept mostly to himself. A former co-worker recalled a man who avoided personal conversations. Another witness described someone capable of switching from polite to intimidating with almost no warning. Individually, these memories carried little evidentiary value. Together, they began sketching the outline of a personality that detectives believed deserved closer examination. The more they learned about Tobin's history, the more striking one characteristic became: control. Former partners described relationships dominated by intimidation. Accounts collected over the years suggested a man who expected obedience, reacted aggressively to perceived disrespect, and concealed much of his private life even from those closest to him. None of those behaviors proved homicide. Millions of abusive individuals never become killers. But criminologists have long recognized that patterns of coercive control often appear in the backgrounds of violent offenders. Detectives could not afford to ignore that possibility. Outside police headquarters, the public's imagination began moving faster than the evidence itself. Newspaper headlines questioned whether Britain's newest convicted murderer had secretly been operating for decades. Television discussions invited retired detectives and criminal psychologists to speculate about unsolved disappearances. Every fresh article encouraged readers to compare old missing person cases against Tobin's known movements. Speculation spread quickly because uncertainty creates its own momentum. People searched maps online. Amateur investigators built timelines. Families of missing women watched every news broadcast, wondering whether this stranger's face might finally explain years of unanswered grief. For detectives leading Operation Anagram, that growing attention created another problem: pressure. Public expectations can quietly reshape investigations if officers are not careful. Every new rumor generated phone calls. Every television interview produced additional tips. Some were sincere. Others were impossible to verify. A few contradicted established facts entirely. Yet every lead required evaluation because dismissing the wrong one could mean overlooking the single detail capable of revealing another victim. The investigation expanded almost organically. Specialists in behavioral analysis examined Tobin's criminal history. Forensic experts revisited evidence collected years earlier using technologies unavailable when the original investigations had taken place. Analysts compared travel records, employment histories, prison releases, vehicle ownership, and witness statements. Slowly, an extraordinary picture emerged. Peter Tobin had crossed paths with an astonishing number of communities over 4 decades. Most people who encountered him remembered nothing unusual. That, in itself, unsettled some investigators. History has repeatedly shown that serial offenders rarely appear monstrous in everyday life. They buy groceries. They greet neighbors. They repair fences. They complain about weather. Their ordinary routines become camouflage, allowing extraordinary violence to remain hidden behind familiar faces. The image disturbed detectives because it challenged comforting assumptions about evil. There is a natural desire to believe that dangerous people announce themselves. That cruelty has an unmistakable appearance. That neighbors would somehow know. Reality is often far less reassuring. As weeks turned into months, officers revisited one discovery that had transformed everything: the excavation of the garden behind Tobin's former property in Margate. When investigators first entered the property, they were searching for answers connected to one victim. Instead, they uncovered the remains of 2 young women who had disappeared separately years earlier. The discovery fundamentally changed how police viewed Tobin. Before then, detectives were investigating a convicted murderer. Afterward, they were confronting the possibility of a serial predator whose crimes stretched across jurisdictions and decades. The implications were enormous. If 2 victims had remained hidden beneath ordinary soil for years, investigators had to consider a painful question. Were there other locations that had never been searched? The answer justified examining every place Tobin had called home. Ground-penetrating surveys were considered where appropriate. Historical property records were reviewed. Construction histories were examined to determine whether landscapes had changed since Tobin's occupancy. Officers interviewed former residents, neighbors, landlords, and contractors, searching for memories that might have seemed insignificant at the time but now demanded renewed attention. Sometimes an old memory resurfaced. A section of garden that had once appeared freshly disturbed. A tenant who had insisted on unusual privacy. An unexpected renovation. Most of these recollections ultimately led nowhere. But investigations of this scale are built upon persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Every eliminated possibility strengthened the integrity of those that remained. Meanwhile, another mystery refused to disappear. The name Bible John resurfaced with increasing frequency. For decades, the unidentified killer had occupied a unique place in Scottish criminal history. The murders attributed to him had generated countless theories, books, documentaries, and police inquiries. No definitive suspect had ever been identified. When similarities between Tobin and the long-unknown offender entered public discussion, fascination intensified almost overnight. Detectives approached the comparison with caution. They examined timelines, physical descriptions, known movements, witness accounts, behavioral characteristics. The similarities were sufficient to justify investigation. They were not sufficient to justify conclusion. That distinction mattered enormously. Operation Anagram was never intended to confirm popular theories. Its purpose was to determine what evidence could actually prove. In many ways, that philosophy separated professional investigation from public speculation. The public asks whether something is possible. Detectives ask whether it can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. Those are profoundly different questions. As the inquiry continued, officers became increasingly aware that they were pursuing 2 parallel investigations. One sought additional victims. The other sought the truth about Peter Tobin himself. Those goals were connected but not identical. A man can be suspected of many crimes while legally responsible for only those supported by evidence. Investigators never forgot that principle. It guided every interview, every excavation, every reopened file, and every painstaking comparison that followed. Because somewhere within thousands of pages of forgotten reports, fading photographs, and decades-old witness statements, they hoped the truth was waiting. Whether that truth would reveal another victim or finally confirm that the known crimes were the full extent of Peter Tobin's violence remained uncertain. And uncertainty, they would soon learn, was the most relentless adversary Operation Anagram would ever face. Before a single additional body could be found, before another unanswered disappearance could be connected to Peter Tobin, investigators had to confront an uncomfortable possibility that sat at the heart of Operation Anagram. They might spend years chasing a ghost that did not exist. They might devote thousands of hours, mobilize hundreds of officers, reopen countless files, and ultimately discover that the 3 murders already attributed to Tobin were the only murders he had ever committed. It was a possibility they could not ignore. Modern criminal investigations are often remembered for dramatic breakthroughs, for DNA matches that arrive at the perfect moment or hidden confessions that suddenly unlock impossible mysteries. The reality is almost always slower. It is built on restraint. Detectives are trained to distrust instinct unless instinct can be supported by evidence. Every exciting theory must survive relentless scrutiny. Every coincidence must withstand careful examination. In cases involving suspected serial offenders, that discipline becomes even more important because fear has a way of filling the spaces where facts are missing. Operation Anagram was not created to prove Peter Tobin was Britain's most prolific unidentified killer. It was created to answer a single question. How much of the truth was still hidden? That question echoed through every office where investigators worked. It followed them home after long shifts. It lingered in conversations between officers who had spent decades investigating homicide. Some had already seen cases where the public dramatically overestimated a suspect's crimes. Others had witnessed the opposite, discovering years later that a murderer once believed responsible for only one victim had quietly claimed many more. Experience had taught them one painful lesson. The dead do not always tell their stories immediately. Sometimes they wait beneath concrete. Sometimes beneath woodland. Sometimes beneath carefully maintained gardens where flowers bloom every spring above secrets no one suspects. The discovery in Margate had permanently altered the psychology of the investigation because it shattered a dangerous assumption. Detectives had believed they understood the scale of Peter Tobin's violence. Then 2 sets of human remains emerged from ground that had been walked across for years without attracting suspicion. If chance had not directed investigators toward that property, would those victims have remained undiscovered for another decade? Another generation? Perhaps forever? No detective wanted to answer that question aloud. Instead, they returned to the files. Thousands upon thousands of pages. Missing daughters. Missing sisters. Missing girlfriends. Young women whose last known moments had been reduced to brief summaries typed years earlier by officers who could never have imagined their reports would one day become part of a national inquiry. A final bus journey. A walk home after work. A music festival. A railway station. A roadside where someone accepted a lift from a stranger. Each disappearance existed in isolation when it first occurred. Operation Anagram forced investigators to ask whether those isolated tragedies might instead belong to a single, much larger pattern. Most would not. Statistics alone made that inevitable. Britain had hundreds of unresolved disappearances spanning decades, many with explanations that remained unknown rather than criminal. Some people had chosen to leave their previous lives behind. Others had died in accidents that left little evidence. Some investigations simply reached dead ends despite every reasonable effort. Detectives understood this better than anyone. Their task was not to transform every mystery into murder. Their responsibility was to eliminate possibilities until only evidence remained. That process demanded extraordinary patience. One timeline after another was reconstructed. Where had Peter Tobin been living? What vehicle did he own? What job was he working? Who could place him in a particular town during a specific month? Had he been incarcerated? Had he been traveling? Could a witness independently verify his location? Every answer either strengthened or weakened a possible connection. Sometimes a promising lead disappeared within hours. A date proved inaccurate. An address belonged to someone else. Employment records established that Tobin had been hundreds of miles away when a woman vanished. The file would close once again. There was disappointment, but also relief. Clearing a suspect matters just as much as identifying one. It protects the integrity of every remaining conclusion. Yet some cases refused to disappear so easily. A disappearance here. A timeline there. A witness who remembered seeing a man resembling Tobin decades earlier. None of it reached the standard required for criminal prosecution. But together they created a persistent unease that investigators could never completely dismiss. Outside police headquarters, speculation continued growing. Books explored the possibility that Tobin's criminal career stretched back much further than anyone had imagined. Documentaries questioned whether Britain had unknowingly lived alongside a serial predator for generations. Internet forums filled with amateur investigators comparing photographs, maps, and historical records. Some theories bordered on the plausible. Others drifted far into imagination. Professional investigators remained careful not to confuse public fascination with factual progress. One name continued surfacing above all others. Bible John. The unidentified killer had become part of Scotland's collective memory, a symbol of unanswered violence that had resisted every attempt at identification. Linking Peter Tobin to that mystery carried enormous emotional weight because solving the Bible John murders would close one of the country's oldest criminal wounds. But emotion cannot replace evidence. Officers compared available material again and again. Physical descriptions. Estimated ages. Geographic movements. Witness testimony. Behavioral characteristics. The similarities justified examination. The differences prevented certainty. No forensic evidence established that Peter Tobin and Bible John were the same individual. No surviving witness could identify him conclusively. No courtroom would accept speculation where proof was absent. And so one of Britain's most compelling criminal theories remained exactly that. A theory. For some observers, that uncertainty felt frustrating. For investigators, it represented professional honesty. Admitting what cannot be proven is just as important as establishing what can. Months became years. Operation Anagram continued its methodical search through Britain's unresolved past, not with dramatic headlines but with quiet persistence. Detectives revisited communities where memories had faded. Families were contacted with compassion and caution. Every conversation carried the possibility of reopening grief that had never truly disappeared. Some relatives welcomed renewed investigation despite the pain. Others had learned to survive by accepting uncertainty. Hope can heal. Hope can also wound. Investigators knew they carried both possibilities every time they knocked on another front door. Eventually, the enormous inquiry reached its most difficult conclusion. Despite extensive investigation, despite years of reviewing evidence from across England and Scotland, despite examining countless disappearances and unsolved murders, there was not enough admissible evidence to prove Peter Tobin had murdered anyone beyond the 3 victims already established in court: Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol. For some, the result sounded incomplete. For detectives, it reflected the standard upon which justice depends. Suspicion is not conviction. Probability is not proof. Questions, no matter how haunting, cannot substitute for evidence. Yet Operation Anagram achieved something profoundly important. It demonstrated that forgotten victims still matter. That decades-old cases deserve renewed attention when new evidence emerges. That investigators have an obligation to pursue uncomfortable possibilities, even when those possibilities ultimately remain unresolved. Most importantly, it reminded Britain that behind every cold case is a family whose calendar stopped on the day someone failed to come home. Some received answers. Many did not. Peter Tobin died in prison in 2022, carrying with him whatever truths remained locked inside his own memory. Whether he was responsible for additional crimes beyond those proven in court may never be known with certainty. The unanswered questions that surrounded his life did not disappear with his death. They simply became quieter, settling once more into police archives, unsolved case files, and the memories of families still waiting for certainty that may never arrive. And perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy of Operation Anagram. Not that it uncovered every answer, but that it proved how easily the past can hide its darkest secrets in plain sight, waiting for one discovery to make an entire nation wonder how much still remains buried beneath the surface. The story of Operation Anagram did not begin inside a police headquarters, nor did it begin with flashing blue lights outside a crime scene. It began years earlier, scattered across towns and cities that, on the surface, had nothing to do with one another. Busy railway stations, quiet suburban streets, aging churches, modest rental homes, and neighborhoods where people knew each other well enough to exchange greetings but not well enough to recognize the private lives unfolding behind closed doors. It was a Britain undergoing steady change, yet beneath that ordinary rhythm lay a reality familiar to every police force. Most violent offenders were not strangers to the criminal justice system. They accumulated histories of assault, theft, sexual violence, or domestic abuse long before their names became known nationally. Peter Tobin's life fit that broader pattern in important ways. Born in Scotland in 1946, he spent decades moving between Scotland and England, living in numerous towns and cities over the course of his adult life. Public records and later investigations showed that he frequently changed addresses and, at times, used different identities. He worked a variety of jobs that brought him into different communities, often for relatively short periods. Individually, None of these facts suggested involvement in homicide. Many people relocate repeatedly throughout their lives. Many change careers. Many disappear from one neighborhood only to begin again in another. It was only after Tobin's conviction for murder that investigators looked back across those years and recognized how difficult it was to reconstruct his movements with confidence. The Britain through which Tobin moved was itself changing. During the late 20th century, policing was far less interconnected than it is today. Information was often stored locally, investigations were conducted within regional jurisdictions, and communication between forces depended heavily on manual record-keeping and direct contact. National databases existed but were far less comprehensive than modern systems. A violent offender who crossed county or national boundaries within the United Kingdom could, in some circumstances, leave behind fragmented records spread across multiple police forces. Detectives working one investigation might never realize that another force held information which, if viewed together, could reveal a larger pattern. This was not negligence. It reflected the technological limitations of the period. Communities themselves were changing as well. Rail travel connected cities more efficiently, temporary employment became increasingly common in certain industries, and people relocated for work with greater frequency. Construction sites, maintenance contracts, seasonal labor, and short-term accommodation created environments where newcomers attracted little attention. A man could arrive in a town, rent a room, find employment, remain for months or years, and leave with relatively few people knowing much about him beyond his first name and occupation. Investigators later recognized that such mobility complicated efforts to reconstruct Tobin's life. Each move required fresh searches through electoral registers, employment records, tenancy agreements, prison documentation, witness interviews, and archived police files. The challenge was not simply determining where he had lived, but establishing precisely when he had been there. Even small errors in dates could dramatically alter the relevance of a potential investigative lead. By the early 2000s, Peter Tobin was living in Glasgow and working as a handyman and maintenance worker. Those who encountered him in professional settings generally saw an older man capable of carrying out practical work around buildings. On the surface, there was little to distinguish him from countless others employed in similar roles. Yet beneath that outward appearance was a substantial criminal history. Long before the murder case that would make international headlines, Tobin had accumulated convictions for serious violent and sexual offenses. His record demonstrated a pattern of criminal conduct extending across many years, including offenses involving violence against women and girls. Those convictions would later become a significant part of investigators' assessment when considering whether his known crimes represented isolated acts or part of a broader history of offending. Even so, criminal history alone cannot establish responsibility for unsolved murders. Detectives involved in Operation Anagram repeatedly emphasized the importance of separating suspicion from evidence. An individual may possess a lengthy record of violent crime without being connected to every unsolved case that occurs nearby. Maintaining that distinction was essential to preserving the integrity of the investigation. The confirmed victims whose cases ultimately became linked to Tobin came from different backgrounds and different moments in time. Their lives did not intersect with one another, and their disappearances initially belonged to separate investigations handled years apart. Only much later would detectives recognize that a single offender had been present in all three cases proven before the courts. This separation illustrates one of the greatest challenges in homicide investigation. Crimes committed years apart, in different jurisdictions and under different circumstances, often appear unrelated until new evidence creates a connection. Before that point, each investigation naturally focuses on the victim's immediate surroundings, family, friends, colleagues, and local suspects. Detectives cannot pursue links they do not yet know exist. When investigators later reconstructed Tobin's history, they found themselves examining not only his criminal record but also the ordinary details of daily life. They reviewed employment histories, vehicle ownership, prison release dates, residential addresses, and documented travel. These records allowed them to build an increasingly detailed timeline, identifying where Tobin could be placed with confidence and where uncertainty remained. The resulting chronology became one of the central tools of Operation Anagram, helping investigators compare his known movements against unresolved disappearances spanning several decades. The investigation also highlighted how advances in forensic science had transformed criminal inquiries. Evidence collected years earlier could sometimes be re-examined using techniques unavailable at the time of the original investigation. Improvements in DNA analysis, digital record management, and forensic archaeology provided opportunities to revisit cases that had once reached investigative dead ends. Operation Anagram therefore represented not only a review of Peter Tobin's past but also a demonstration of how evolving investigative methods could breathe new life into long-standing cases. Public interest in the inquiry grew steadily as details emerged. Media coverage often focused on the possibility that Tobin might have been responsible for additional crimes beyond those already proven in court. Detectives, however, adopted a more measured approach. Their objective was neither to confirm nor to dismiss speculation prematurely. Instead, they sought to establish what could be supported by reliable evidence. This distinction shaped every stage of the inquiry and remains one of its defining characteristics. Against this backdrop, Operation Anagram began to take shape not as a search driven by headlines, but as a systematic effort to reconstruct decades of history with precision. Every confirmed address, every documented movement, every surviving witness statement, and every preserved case file became part of an increasingly complex picture. Whether that picture would ultimately reveal additional victims remained uncertain. What was certain was that investigators were now looking at Peter Tobin's life not as a series of isolated events, but as a timeline whose significance could only be understood by examining it in its entirety. Throughout the investigation, detectives repeatedly returned to a principle that has guided major homicide inquiries for decades: understanding an offender requires understanding the world in which that offender operated. Peter Tobin's movements could not be viewed in isolation. They had to be placed within the social, technological, and policing environment of Britain during the final decades of the 20th century. Between the 1970s and the early 2000s, police investigations were often constrained by the practical realities of the era. Information sharing between forces was improving, but it was still far from seamless. Individual police services maintained their own records, investigative priorities naturally focused on local crimes, and computer systems evolved gradually rather than all at once. When an offender moved repeatedly between jurisdictions, reconstructing that person's history years later could become an enormous undertaking. Detectives involved in Operation Anagram therefore spent considerable time reconciling records from different regions, confirming dates, and eliminating inconsistencies before drawing any conclusions. This painstaking work reflected the standards expected in a major criminal inquiry. Every confirmed address associated with Tobin had to be supported by documentation wherever possible. Electoral records, tenancy information, prison records, employment histories, and witness interviews all contributed pieces to the larger chronology. The resulting timeline was not simply an administrative exercise. It allowed investigators to determine where Tobin could reliably be placed at particular moments and, equally importantly, where he could not. That distinction mattered because speculation had begun to outpace evidence. As media coverage expanded, questions emerged about whether Tobin might be connected to numerous unresolved disappearances across Britain. Some similarities appeared noteworthy. Certain missing persons had disappeared while Tobin was known to be living nearby. Others vanished during periods when his documented whereabouts remained less certain. Yet proximity alone does not establish criminal responsibility. Detectives therefore approached every potential connection with the same disciplined methodology: first establish the timeline, then examine available evidence, and only afterwards consider whether further investigation was justified. The inquiry also highlighted the complexity of long-term investigations involving historical cases. Witnesses who had spoken to police decades earlier were sometimes interviewed again, not because their original statements were considered inadequate, but because new information occasionally changed the significance of details that had once seemed unimportant. Human memory, however, changes over time. Investigators remained cautious when evaluating recollections offered many years after the events themselves. Wherever possible, memories were compared against contemporaneous records rather than accepted in isolation. Forensic science also played a significant role in shaping the investigation. Advances in DNA profiling and forensic archaeology had transformed the way historical cases could be examined. Material collected years earlier could sometimes be re-evaluated using methods unavailable during the original investigation. In addition, improvements in forensic excavation techniques informed the careful examination of locations associated with Tobin when investigators believed there were reasonable grounds to conduct searches. These developments reflected broader changes within criminal investigation rather than innovations unique to Operation Anagram, but they nevertheless expanded the range of evidence that could be considered. As detectives reconstructed Tobin's documented history, they also reviewed his known criminal record. Prior convictions demonstrated a pattern of serious violent and sexual offending extending over many years. Those convictions were directly relevant because they established behaviors already proven before the courts. At the same time, investigators remained mindful that previous convictions, however serious, could not substitute for evidence in unrelated cases. The inquiry therefore distinguished carefully between confirmed criminal conduct and unproven allegations. Media attention intensified whenever Operation Anagram became publicly visible. Newspapers, television programs, and later documentary productions frequently examined the possibility that Tobin had committed additional murders. Among the most widely discussed questions was whether he might have been connected to the unidentified offender known as Bible John, whose murders in Glasgow during the late 1960s remain one of Scotland's most enduring unsolved cases. Detectives reviewed that possibility alongside other investigative leads. They compared timelines, available descriptions, and relevant evidence, but no conclusive forensic or testimonial evidence established that Tobin and Bible John were the same individual. Consequently, no such conclusion was reached by investigators. The operation therefore occupied an unusual position within British criminal history. It was both retrospective and forward-looking. Detectives examined events stretching back decades while applying modern investigative methods to determine whether additional crimes could be identified. Every lead required balancing openness to new possibilities with adherence to evidentiary standards. In practice, this meant that many potential links were examined and ultimately excluded because the available evidence did not support them. Operation Anagram also underscored the importance of collaboration between police forces. Cases originating in different regions required coordination across jurisdictions, reflecting the reality that serious offenders do not necessarily remain within the administrative boundaries of a single police service. Information that appeared routine in one investigation could assume greater significance when viewed alongside records from another. Bringing those materials together demanded extensive coordination among investigators, analysts, forensic specialists, and support staff over an extended period. By the time the inquiry was fully underway, investigators had assembled one of the most comprehensive reconstructions of Peter Tobin's documented movements ever undertaken. The resulting body of work served two purposes. It assisted in evaluating unresolved disappearances that warranted renewed attention, and it provided a factual foundation against which speculation could be tested. Some theories became stronger after comparison with the evidence. Others weakened or were eliminated altogether. In each instance, the objective remained the same: to determine what the evidence could genuinely support, rather than what public interest or intuition might suggest. This methodical approach defined Operation Anagram from beginning to end. Rather than pursuing dramatic conclusions, investigators concentrated on assembling verified facts, recognizing that major criminal inquiries are built not on isolated discoveries but on the cumulative weight of carefully tested evidence. It was within that disciplined framework that the investigation continued, gradually revealing the confirmed history of one convicted murderer while confronting the enduring uncertainties that surrounded the possibility of others. As Operation Anagram continued, investigators were forced to confront one of the most difficult aspects of examining a suspected serial offender: the difference between a pattern and a coincidence. The human mind naturally searches for connections. When a person is linked to one horrific crime, people instinctively begin looking backward, searching through every unexplained event that occurred around that individual. It is a powerful instinct, and sometimes it leads to discoveries that would otherwise remain hidden. But it can also create assumptions that evidence cannot support. For the detectives working on Operation Anagram, this balance became central to everything they did. Peter Tobin had already been proven responsible for 3 murders. That fact alone placed him among Scotland's most notorious criminals. But the possibility that he may have been responsible for more victims carried enormous consequences. Every potential connection had to be treated with seriousness, yet every accusation had to meet the same legal standard required in any criminal investigation. The victims were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people whose lives had existed long before their names appeared in police files. This understanding shaped the way investigators approached unresolved cases. They were not simply looking for evidence against Tobin. They were revisiting the stories of people who had disappeared and whose families had spent years living without answers. A missing person report represented more than an administrative record. Behind every report was a person who had been loved, someone whose absence had changed the lives of parents, siblings, partners, and friends. That perspective influenced the atmosphere surrounding Operation Anagram. The investigation was not only about examining the past of a convicted murderer. It was also about acknowledging the unfinished stories of those who had vanished. Among the many questions investigators examined was whether Tobin's behavior had followed a recognizable pattern. Criminal psychologists and investigators studying serial offenders often look for consistency in methods, victim selection, geographical behavior, and periods of activity. However, real criminal behavior rarely follows a perfect pattern. Offenders adapt. Circumstances change. Opportunities appear and disappear. The absence of an obvious pattern does not eliminate the possibility of a connection, but the presence of similarities alone cannot prove one. In Tobin's case, investigators examined whether his known movements corresponded with unresolved cases involving young women. They considered locations where he had lived, worked, or spent significant periods of time. They reviewed reports from different police forces and looked for information that had previously existed separately but might become significant when viewed together. The sheer volume of information made the process challenging. A single missing person investigation may contain hundreds of documents. When multiplied across decades and multiple regions, the scale becomes enormous. Each file had to be reviewed carefully. Names had to be checked against addresses. Dates had to be compared. Witness accounts had to be evaluated. Investigators needed to determine whether a possible connection was supported by evidence or simply created by timing and geography. Many potential links were eliminated. A person who appeared to be connected through location might have been elsewhere at the relevant time. A similarity between cases might disappear after examining the details. A witness memory might prove unreliable when compared against official records. This process was not a failure. In major investigations, elimination is progress. Removing unsupported theories allows investigators to focus resources where evidence is strongest. One of the most publicly discussed theories surrounding Tobin was the possibility that he could have been connected to the unsolved Bible John murders. The case had haunted Scotland for decades. During the late 1960s, 3 women were murdered in Glasgow after visiting the Barrowland Ballroom, a popular dance venue. The unidentified suspect became known as Bible John because witnesses reported that he had made references to religious themes during conversations. Despite extensive police efforts over many years, the identity of the offender was never conclusively established. When Peter Tobin's name later entered public discussion, comparisons emerged because he had lived in Glasgow during the relevant period. Some observers believed there were similarities worth examining. Investigators therefore reviewed the possibility as part of their wider assessment. However, the passage of time created significant challenges. Decades had passed. Memories had faded. Available evidence was limited. And crucially, no forensic evidence connected Tobin to those murders. The investigation demonstrated an important reality of cold case work. Even compelling theories require proof. A suspect may fit aspects of a description or share certain characteristics with an unknown offender, but criminal cases cannot be built on resemblance alone. The Bible John theory remained unresolved. It became one of many unanswered questions associated with Peter Tobin's name, but it never became an established fact. As the years passed, Operation Anagram continued to examine information from across Britain. The inquiry became a reminder that solving crime is rarely a straight path from discovery to conclusion. Instead, it is a process of assembling fragments, testing possibilities, and accepting uncertainty when evidence reaches its limit. For the families connected to unsolved disappearances, the investigation carried complicated emotions. Renewed attention could bring hope that answers might finally emerge. At the same time, it could reopen painful memories that had never fully healed. Many families had spent years adapting to uncertainty, creating lives around an absence that could not be explained. The possibility of answers was both a comfort and a source of fear. Because sometimes the truth provides closure. And sometimes the truth confirms the tragedy that families had always feared. Investigators understood this deeply. Contacting relatives was not simply part of gathering information. It required sensitivity, patience, and recognition that every conversation involved real human loss. This human element remained present throughout Operation Anagram. Behind the legal questions and investigative procedures was a much larger story about memory, justice, and time. Time had helped conceal Peter Tobin's actions. But time also preserved evidence. Old records remained. Photographs survived. Witnesses remembered. Advances in forensic science created opportunities that investigators decades earlier could never have imagined. The past was no longer completely unreachable. Yet even with all those advantages, one reality remained unavoidable: evidence determines what can be proven. Operation Anagram uncovered significant information about Peter Tobin's life and confirmed the identities of 3 victims whose cases had once been unresolved. It revealed failures of opportunity, gaps in understanding, and the difficulty of recognizing a dangerous offender before the full extent of his actions becomes visible. But it also demonstrated the limits of investigation. A suspicion can be powerful. A theory can be convincing. A pattern can appear undeniable. But justice requires something more. It requires evidence strong enough to transform uncertainty into fact. And as Operation Anagram moved toward its final conclusions, investigators had to accept that some questions surrounding Peter Tobin might never receive definitive answers. The investigation had reached further back into his life than anyone had expected, but there remained a boundary between what was suspected and what could be proven. Beyond that boundary was a landscape of unanswered questions. A place where families continued waiting. A place where history remained incomplete. Before Peter Tobin became a name associated with investigations, courtrooms, and unanswered questions, the women whose lives were taken were simply people living ordinary days. They had families. They had plans. They had memories that existed long before their names appeared in police reports. In many true crime investigations, the attention naturally moves toward the offender. The investigation, the evidence, the courtroom, and the mystery surrounding the person accused of terrible acts often dominate the story. But behind every case file is a human life that existed independently of the crime committed against them. Operation Anagram was ultimately an investigation into Peter Tobin's movements and possible crimes, but at its heart were the stories of those who disappeared and the families who waited years for answers. Among the confirmed victims connected to Tobin were 3 women whose lives ended in different places and different circumstances: Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol. Their stories began not with tragedy, but with ordinary hopes and everyday experiences. This is where their stories deserve to begin. With who they were. Not how they died. Angelica Cluck was 23 years old when her life came to an abrupt end in Glasgow in 2006. She was originally from Poland and had moved to Scotland seeking opportunities and a different future. Like many people who leave their home country, Angelica carried with her the challenge of adapting to a new environment. A different language, different customs, different surroundings. Yet those challenges did not define her. People who knew Angelica remembered a young woman who was building a life for herself. She was studying, working, and trying to create stability in a country far from where she had grown up. She represented a generation of young Europeans who crossed borders in search of education, employment, and new experiences. In Glasgow, she worked at St. Patrick's Church in Anderston, helping with cleaning duties and other tasks. The church was not just a workplace. It was part of the environment where she spent her days, a place connected with routine and familiarity. There was nothing about that ordinary setting that suggested danger. A church, by its very nature, represents safety for many people. It is a place where individuals expect compassion, trust, and protection. The idea that violence could occur there created a sense of shock far beyond the immediate investigation. For those who knew Angelica, the tragedy was not simply the loss of a young woman. It was the loss of a future. A future that included possibilities she would never experience. A future that her family would never see unfold. When Angelica disappeared in September 2006, the initial concern was focused on finding her. At that stage, there was still hope. Missing person investigations always carry that fragile possibility that the person will return. Families hold on to small signs, waiting for a phone call, a message, a piece of information that changes everything. But as days passed, the uncertainty grew heavier. The investigation that followed would eventually expose a crime that shocked Scotland and led detectives toward Peter Tobin. Yet even after the arrest, even after the courtroom proceedings, the central truth remained unchanged. A young woman who had traveled to Scotland looking for a better life was gone. Her family had lost someone irreplaceable. Years before Angelica Cluck's death, 2 teenagers disappeared in cases that remained unsolved for more than a decade. The first was Vicky Hamilton. Vicky was 15 years old when she vanished in 1991. At 15, life is often defined by beginnings. Friendships become more important. Independence begins to grow. The future feels distant but full of possibilities. For many teenagers, the world is gradually expanding beyond childhood, bringing new experiences and new responsibilities. Vicky was a young girl at that point in her life. She had a family. She had people who cared about her. She had a future that should have continued. On February 10, 1991, Vicky was seen waiting at a bus stop in Bathgate, West Lothian. It was an ordinary moment, the kind of moment that happens thousands of times every day. A teenager waiting for transportation. A person moving through a familiar routine. Then she disappeared. At first, her disappearance was a mystery without answers. Her family waited. Searches were conducted. Information was collected. But time passed without resolution. For years, the unanswered question remained the same. What happened to Vicky? Her disappearance became one of many missing person cases that remained open, a file waiting for the discovery of new information. Behind the official language of police records was a much more painful reality. A family living with uncertainty. Birthdays passing without celebration. Holidays marked by absence. Years accumulating without explanation. The disappearance of a loved one creates a unique form of grief. There is no clear ending. No moment when a family can fully understand what happened. Instead, there is a constant state of waiting, where hope and fear exist together. For more than 16 years, that was the reality faced by Vicky's family. They did not know where she was. They did not know what had happened. They could only continue searching for answers. Dinah McNichol was 18 years old when she disappeared in 1991. Like Vicky, she was young, with an entire life ahead of her. Dinah disappeared after attending the A-Level Music Festival in Liphook, Hampshire, in August 1991. She had been enjoying an event that represented youth, freedom, and the experiences that often define early adulthood. Music festivals are usually remembered as places of excitement. Friends gathering together. New memories being created. people experiencing a temporary escape from everyday life. For Dinah, however, that journey became the last known chapter of her life. After the festival, she vanished. Her family was left with questions that had no answers. Where had she gone? Who had she met? Could something have been done differently? These are questions many families of missing people carry for years, even when they understand intellectually that they are not responsible. The human mind naturally searches for explanations after tragedy. It looks backward, examining every decision, every conversation, every moment before the disappearance. For Dinah's family, time did not erase the loss. It simply changed the way they carried it. The world continued moving forward. People around them grew older. Technology changed. New generations arrived. But somewhere, frozen in 1991, was the unanswered mystery of an 18-year-old who never returned home. The connections between Angelica, Vicky, and Dinah were not immediately obvious. They lived in different places. They disappeared in different years. Their families had no reason to believe their stories were connected. That is one of the most painful realities of long-term criminal investigations. Sometimes the truth exists, but the connections remain invisible. A victim's disappearance may be investigated as a single event because investigators only have the information available at that moment. Without evidence linking separate cases, every disappearance must be treated individually. For Vicky and Dinah, the answers would not come quickly. For Angelica, the truth would emerge much faster, but at a devastating cost. Their stories eventually became connected through the investigation into Peter Tobin, but they were never defined by him. They were defined by the lives they lived before his name entered their stories. Angelica was more than a victim found inside a church. Vicky was more than a missing teenager whose case remained unresolved. Dinah was more than a name in a decades-old investigation. They were daughters, friends, and individuals whose futures mattered. And as Operation Anagram expanded, detectives were not simply searching for evidence against one man. They were searching for answers for the people who had been waiting the longest. For families who had spent years wondering. For memories that deserved to be recovered. For lives that deserved to be remembered. For the families of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, the passage of time did not bring closure. It brought a different kind of existence, one shaped by uncertainty. When a person dies, grief follows a painful but recognizable path. There is a moment of loss, a moment when reality becomes undeniable. There are funerals, memories shared, photographs displayed, and eventually a process of learning how to live with absence. But when someone disappears, grief becomes something more complicated. There is no final goodbye. No certainty. No place to direct the pain. Families of missing people often live between two impossible realities. One part of them understands that something terrible may have happened. Another part continues waiting for the possibility that the person they love might somehow return. A phone call. A knock at the door. A stranger with information. A piece of evidence discovered after years of silence. That uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. For Vicky Hamilton's family, the disappearance of a 15-year-old girl created a wound that remained open for more than a decade. Every year that passed carried the same unanswered question. What had happened on that day in February 1991? Vicky had been a teenager at the beginning of her life, an age where the future still seemed endless. 15 years old is an age of transition. A person is no longer a child, yet still has so many experiences ahead. Friendships, education, adulthood, relationships, and dreams are all still forming. Those possibilities were suddenly interrupted. The investigation into her disappearance continued, but like many missing person cases, it faced the difficult reality of limited information. There was no confirmed explanation, no clear path forward, and no immediate evidence that could reveal what had happened. Years passed. The world changed around the family. Technology advanced. New methods of investigation developed. But the unanswered questions remained. For families waiting for information, time has a strange quality. The calendar continues moving, but emotionally, Part of life remains fixed at the moment of disappearance. Important occasions become reminders of absence. Birthdays become difficult milestones. Anniversaries mark not only the passing of another year, but another year without answers. The same painful uncertainty surrounded Dinah McNichol's disappearance. At 18 years old, Dinah was entering adulthood. She had experienced the excitement and independence that comes with youth. Attending a music festival represented a moment of freedom, a chance to spend time with others and create memories. Instead, it became the final known chapter of her life. For her family, the years afterward were defined by questions that could not be answered. Investigators continued searching. Information was reviewed. Possible leads were examined. But the case remained unresolved. Every missing person investigation carries its own difficulties, but cases involving young people often create a particularly powerful public response. People imagine the fear surrounding the final moments. They imagine the families waiting at home. They imagine the ordinary plans that were never completed. Yet behind the public attention are private moments that few people ever see. Families opening old photographs. Families remembering voices that have not been heard for years. Families keeping belongings exactly as they were because changing anything feels like accepting a reality they are not ready to face. The passage of time can create a painful contradiction. The world expects people to move forward. But some losses cannot simply be left behind. When Peter Tobin was arrested in connection with the murder of Angelica Cluck in 2006, investigators began examining his background. At first, the focus was on the immediate crime. But as detectives uncovered more about his history, the possibility emerged that he might be connected to older cases. For the families of Vicky and Dinah, this development brought a mixture of emotions. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a possibility that answers might come. But those answers carried a devastating implication. Finding the truth meant accepting that their loved ones were no longer missing. They were victims of murder. For many families, this moment represents one of the most difficult stages of a long investigation. The search for a missing person is often driven by hope. Even when the possibility seems unlikely, hope can survive for years. A confirmed death brings certainty, but certainty can be painful. The discovery of Vicky and Dinah's remains in 2007, after investigators searched a property connected to Tobin, finally provided answers. The news transformed 2 decades of uncertainty into a confirmed tragedy. For investigators, it represented a major breakthrough. For the families, it was something far more complicated. The questions that had haunted them for years were finally answered. But the answers were heartbreaking. No investigation can return the years lost. No courtroom decision can restore the future that was taken. Justice can recognize wrongdoing. It can establish responsibility. But it cannot reverse time. The story of Angelica, Vicky, and Dinah also highlights a broader truth about criminal investigations. Victims must remain at the center of the story. When cases become associated with notorious offenders, there is a risk that the offender's name becomes larger than the lives they destroyed. Headlines repeat the suspect's name. Documentaries examine their behavior. Public curiosity focuses on their background and psychology. But the victims existed before the crime. They had personalities. They had relationships. They had ordinary moments that mattered. Angelica had built a new life away from her birthplace. Vicky was a teenager whose future had only begun. Dinah was a young woman experiencing the independence of early adulthood. Their lives cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. This understanding influenced the way Operation Anagram was viewed by many investigators. The purpose was not simply to understand Peter Tobin. It was to provide answers to people who had spent years living with uncertainty. Every file reviewed represented someone's missing person report. Every address examined represented a possible location connected to someone's final days. Every interview represented an attempt to recover pieces of a story that had remained incomplete. The discovery of the truth about Vicky and Dinah also changed the perception of Peter Tobin's crimes. Before those discoveries, The murder of Angelica Cluck appeared to be an isolated case involving a dangerous individual. Afterward, investigators were forced to reconsider the scale of his offending. A man who had already been convicted of serious crimes was now connected to murders committed 15 years earlier. The timeline had expanded. The investigation had expanded. And the questions had multiplied. If Tobin had been responsible for crimes in 1991, investigators had to ask whether other years in his history required examination. Other places. Other disappearances. Other families still waiting. This was the moment when the investigation moved beyond a single homicide case and became something much larger. Operation Anagram was no longer only about proving what had happened. It was about determining how much of Peter Tobin's history remained hidden. And as detectives began looking deeper into the decades before Angelica Cluck's murder, they entered a world of unanswered questions, forgotten files, and unresolved disappearances. A world where every timeline mattered. Every location mattered. And every victim deserved to be remembered. When Operation Anagram expanded, investigators were not only examining the actions of Peter Tobin. They were also confronting the uncomfortable reality that many missing person cases fade from public attention long before they are resolved. A headline appears. A search begins. A community looks for answers. Then, as weeks become months and months become years, the attention slowly decreases. The photographs that once appeared on television screens are no longer seen as often. The names that once dominated news reports become known mainly to the families who continue waiting. For detectives reviewing decades of unresolved cases, one of the most important tasks was restoring those names to the center of the investigation. Because behind every unresolved file was a person. Someone who had once walked through a town, entered a workplace, sat at a kitchen table, laughed with friends, and imagined a future that would never arrive. The work of Operation Anagram required investigators to look beyond the confirmed victims and examine the possibility that other people might have crossed paths with Tobin during periods when his movements remained uncertain. This process was complex. A person's life leaves behind thousands of small traces. Addresses. Employment records. Relationships. Travel. Financial information. Conversations remembered by others. When investigators attempt to reconstruct decades of history, they are essentially rebuilding a life piece by piece. But a reconstructed timeline is only meaningful when compared against reliable evidence. A person being present in the same town as a disappearance does not prove involvement. A similar age or appearance does not prove involvement. A troubling background does not prove involvement. These principles were particularly important in an investigation surrounded by public fear and speculation. Once a convicted murderer becomes linked to a larger number of possible crimes, there is a natural desire to find explanations for every unanswered mystery. But investigators understood that every unsolved case represented a real person and a real family. Turning uncertainty into accusation without evidence could create another injustice. The challenge was to search widely while concluding carefully. The confirmed cases of Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol demonstrated how easily connections between crimes can remain hidden for years. Vicky disappeared in 1991. Dinah disappeared later that same year. Angelica was murdered in 2006. At the time, nobody investigating those individual cases could have known they would eventually become connected through one offender. That reality changed the way detectives viewed historical investigations. A case that appears isolated may not remain isolated forever. New evidence can change the meaning of old information. A detail that once seemed insignificant can become important when viewed from a different perspective. This is one of the reasons cold case investigations require patience. Investigators are not simply searching for new evidence. Sometimes they are searching for a new way to understand evidence that already exists. As detectives reviewed Tobin's history, they examined the many different environments in which he had lived. The communities themselves varied greatly. Some were urban areas where thousands of people passed through streets every day. Others were smaller communities where neighbors were more likely to notice unfamiliar faces. Some locations were temporary stops in Tobin's life. Others represented longer periods where he established routines. Each place created a different investigative challenge. In a large city, anonymity can make it easier for individuals to disappear into ordinary life. In a smaller community, people may remember unusual behavior but struggle to connect it to a crime years later. Time changes everything. Buildings are renovated. Businesses close. People move away. Memories become less certain. Yet investigators continued searching because even small details can sometimes become significant. A conversation remembered by a former neighbor. A record stored in an archive. A document that survived decades of administrative changes. A name appearing in an unexpected location. The process was slow, but that was the nature of the investigation. Operation Anagram was not built around a single dramatic discovery. It was built around thousands of small pieces of information examined together. One of the most difficult aspects of studying possible serial offenders is understanding the difference between known victims and suspected victims. In the cases proven against Peter Tobin, investigators had evidence strong enough to satisfy the criminal justice system. They had identifiable victims. They had forensic evidence. They had circumstances that could be presented in court. Beyond those cases, the situation was different. There were questions. There were possibilities. There were cases that appeared worthy of examination. But questions are not conclusions. A responsible investigation must be willing to say, "This remains unknown." That phrase can be difficult for families to hear. It can also be difficult for the public to accept. People want complete answers. They want every mystery solved, every missing person located, every offender fully exposed. But real investigations do not always provide that ending. Sometimes the evidence reaches a boundary. Sometimes the truth exists beyond what can be proven. The investigation into Peter Tobin also raised broader questions about how society recognizes dangerous individuals. Looking back, it can seem obvious that warning signs existed. His criminal history. His violence. His behavior toward others. But hindsight has a way of creating clarity that was unavailable at the time. People rarely see the complete picture while events are unfolding. A neighbor sees a neighbor. A coworker sees a coworker. A landlord sees a tenant. Each person sees only a small part of a much larger story. Investigators involved in Operation Anagram were not searching for someone who looked like a stereotypical criminal. They were examining the reality that offenders can exist within ordinary environments. They can maintain routines. They can interact with communities. They can leave behind memories that seem unremarkable until later events give them new meaning. This was one of the most unsettling aspects of the Tobin investigation. The possibility that an individual could move through different communities for decades while leaving behind only fragments of suspicion. As Operation Anagram continued, the identities of confirmed victims remained the foundation of the investigation. Angelica Cluck. Vicky Hamilton. Dinah McNichol. 3 names. 3 lives. 3 families forever changed. Their cases demonstrated both the power and limitations of criminal investigation. The truth eventually emerged. But it emerged slowly. Years after Vicky and Dinah disappeared. Days after Angelica was murdered. After families had already endured unimaginable waiting. Their stories became part of a much larger investigation, but they were never merely evidence. They were the reason the investigation mattered. The legacy of Operation Anagram is not only found in police files or courtroom records. It exists in the reminder that unresolved cases are not forgotten simply because time passes. A missing person does not become less important because years go by. A family's grief does not expire. A question does not disappear because an answer takes decades to find. For the investigators who worked through thousands of pages and countless possibilities, the mission remained focused on one central idea. Every person deserves to know what happened to the people they love. And every victim deserves to be remembered as more than the crime that ended their life. Before Peter Tobin became the subject of one of Britain's largest criminal investigations, Angelica, Vicky, and Dinah were individuals with their own stories. Operation Anagram revealed the circumstances that connected their deaths. But their lives existed long before the investigation began. And that is where their stories truly belong. 4 years, the lives of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol remained separated by distance, circumstance, and unanswered questions. Their disappearances belonged to different police files, handled by different investigators, in different parts of Britain. There was no obvious connection that could unite them. Then, in 2006, a new case emerged in Glasgow. A young woman named Angelica Cluck disappeared. At first, investigators were faced with a single missing person inquiry. As with many cases of this nature, the earliest hours were critical. Police had to establish where Angelica had been, who had seen her, and what circumstances surrounded her disappearance. Angelica was living and working in Glasgow at the time. She had been employed at St. Patrick's Church in Anderston, where she carried out cleaning and other duties. To those familiar with the location, it was an ordinary workplace. A building associated with daily routines, community activity, and religious services. There was nothing immediately obvious to suggest that it would become the center of a major criminal investigation. But as detectives began gathering information, attention turned toward the people who had access to the building. Among those individuals was Peter Tobin. At that stage, Tobin was not an unknown figure. He had a criminal history that included serious offenses, and investigators were aware of his background. However, a criminal record alone does not determine responsibility for a new crime. Detectives still needed evidence connecting him to Angelica's disappearance. The investigation began with the careful collection of information. Who had been inside the church? Who had contact with Angelica? What movements could be established? What evidence existed? Every detail mattered. The early stages of a homicide investigation are often defined by uncertainty. Investigators know that something serious may have happened, but they must work through facts rather than assumptions. They must separate what is known from what is suspected. In Angelica's case, the search quickly became a race against time. Her family and friends wanted answers. Investigators needed to understand what had happened. And every passing hour increased the importance of finding reliable information. As police examined the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, evidence began pointing toward Tobin. The investigation moved from a missing person inquiry into a murder investigation, with Tobin becoming the central suspect. The discovery of Angelica's body inside the church confirmed the worst fears of those searching for her. It also transformed the case. A missing woman had become the victim of a confirmed homicide. For investigators, the focus shifted from finding Angelica to proving how and why she had died. The work became a detailed examination of evidence, witness accounts, forensic findings, and Tobin's movements around the time of her disappearance. The case attracted significant public attention. The location itself contributed to the shock. A place associated with trust and community had become connected with a violent crime. Many people struggled to understand how such an event could happen in a familiar environment. But for detectives, the priority remained the same: building a case based on evidence. Peter Tobin was arrested and later charged in connection with Angelica's murder. As the investigation continued, officers began examining Tobin's wider history. They looked beyond the immediate circumstances of the Glasgow case and started asking questions about his previous movements, previous addresses, and previous interactions with the criminal justice system. This was the moment when the investigation began expanding beyond one victim. The information gathered during the Angelica Cluck investigation would eventually lead detectives toward older cases that had remained unresolved for many years. At first, the connection was not obvious. A murder in Glasgow in 2006. A teenage girl missing from Scotland in 1991. A young woman disappearing from Hampshire in the same year. Different victims. Different locations. Different decades. But the investigation into Peter Tobin created the possibility that these separate tragedies might share a common link. That possibility changed everything. For detectives, the discovery was not simply about uncovering more crimes. It was about revisiting unanswered questions that had remained unresolved for families for years. Every investigation carries responsibility. But investigations involving possible serial offenders carry another layer of complexity. Detectives must examine the possibility of additional victims while remaining focused on evidence. They must consider the past without allowing speculation to replace proof. The case of Angelica Cluck became the doorway into that much larger examination. What began as the search for one missing woman became an investigation into decades of history. The name Peter Tobin would soon become associated not only with one crime, but with a much broader effort to understand whether other lives had been affected by his actions. That effort would become Operation Anagram. And for investigators, the questions had only begun. When Peter Tobin became the focus of the investigation into Angelica Cluck's murder, detectives were faced with a challenge that extended far beyond the immediate crime. They had to understand not only what had happened in Glasgow in 2006, but also who Peter Tobin had been during the decades before that moment. A person's history can often appear ordinary when viewed one piece at a time. A job here. A new address there. A relationship that ended. A town left behind. A fresh beginning somewhere else. But when investigators examine that history after a serious crime, they are not simply looking at events. They are looking for patterns. For Peter Tobin, the investigation revealed a life marked by movement. Over several decades, he had lived in different parts of Scotland and England. He had changed addresses repeatedly. He had entered and exited relationships. He had worked in various occupations. His name appeared in different records across different locations. At first glance, these details described a person who moved frequently. After his conviction, however, investigators had to consider whether those movements had another significance. Were they simply the choices of an unstable individual? Or did they create opportunities for offending to remain hidden? The answer required a careful reconstruction of the past. Detectives began reviewing Tobin's background in detail. They examined where he had lived, where he had worked, and what was known about his activities during different periods of his life. As they built this timeline, one particular period drew renewed attention. The year 1991. 15 years before Angelica Cluck's murder, two young women had disappeared in separate incidents that had remained unresolved for years. Vicky Hamilton was 15 years old when she vanished in Scotland. Dinah McNichol was 18 when she disappeared in Hampshire. For more than a decade, their families had lived without knowing what had happened. Now investigators were asking whether those cases could be connected to the same man. The possibility was both significant and deeply troubling. Cold case investigations often depend on finding connections that were invisible at the time. In 1991, police investigating Vicky's disappearance had no reason to believe a man who would later be arrested in a Glasgow murder case might somehow be connected. The same was true for Dinah's disappearance. The cases existed separately. The connection emerged only after new information changed the way investigators viewed the past. This is one of the most difficult aspects of investigating suspected serial offenders. The evidence often does not appear as a single dramatic revelation. Instead, it develops slowly as investigators compare timelines, locations, and circumstances. The question was not simply whether Tobin had lived near these places. It was whether there was evidence linking him to the disappearances. That distinction became the foundation of the investigation. As detectives examined the possibility of a connection, they looked closely at Tobin's movements around the time Vicky and Dinah disappeared. Where had he been living? Where had he been working? Could witnesses place him in certain locations? Did records support or challenge possible links? The investigation required patience because decades had passed. Buildings had changed. People had moved away. Records were incomplete. Memories had faded. A witness remembering an event from 15 years earlier might recall important details, but investigators had to compare those memories against documentary evidence wherever possible. The passage of time was both an obstacle and an opportunity. It was an obstacle because information was harder to recover. But it was also an opportunity because advances in forensic science allowed investigators to examine evidence that had previously provided no answers. When police searched a property connected to Tobin in Margate, they uncovered evidence that dramatically changed the investigation. The discovery of human remains linked to Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol transformed two missing person cases into homicide investigations. For their families, the discovery brought the end of uncertainty. But it also confirmed the tragedy they had feared. The young women they had spent years hoping to find were no longer missing. They had been victims of murder. For detectives, the discovery was a turning point. Before this moment, Peter Tobin was a convicted murderer connected to one known victim. After this moment, investigators were confronting the possibility that his criminal history extended much further back. The timeline had expanded by 15 years. The investigation had expanded across different regions. And the number of unanswered questions had grown. The discovery also raised a broader question. If Peter Tobin had been responsible for crimes in 1991, could there have been others? This question was not unusual in investigations involving suspected serial offenders. Once a person is linked to multiple crimes separated by time and location, investigators must consider whether other cases deserve examination. However, this process must be approached carefully. A dangerous offender is not automatically responsible for every unsolved crime from the same period. Investigators cannot simply look for cases that match a theory. They must follow evidence. This principle became central to Operation Anagram. The operation was created to examine the possibility of additional victims, but it was never designed to prove a predetermined conclusion. Officers reviewed information with an open mind, knowing that some connections would be meaningful while others would ultimately lead nowhere. Thousands of files were considered. Many possibilities were investigated. Many theories were rejected. That was the reality of the process. For every potential connection, there had to be evidence. The investigation into Tobin's past also brought renewed attention to his earlier criminal behavior. Long before the murders for which he was convicted, Tobin had already demonstrated a history of serious offending. His previous convictions provided investigators with important background information when assessing his behavior and potential risk. But again, detectives had to maintain a careful distinction. A history of violence may explain why someone is considered dangerous. It does not, by itself, prove involvement in unrelated crimes. The evidence connected to Vicky and Dinah had to stand independently. And ultimately, it did. The cases demonstrated the importance of continuing to investigate disappearances even when years have passed. A case that appears impossible to solve may still contain evidence waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right investigative connection. The events surrounding Peter Tobin created a painful realization for many people involved. Somewhere within years of unanswered questions, the truth had existed all along. Vicky's family had spent more than 15 years waiting. Dinah's family had spent more than 15 years searching. Angelica's disappearance had triggered an investigation that reached backward through time and uncovered answers that had seemed impossible. But answers came with a cost. They revealed that the mystery was not one of survival or disappearance. It was a story of violence. And for investigators, that realization created a new responsibility. They had uncovered connections between 3 victims. Now they had to determine whether there were more. That question would become the driving force behind Operation Anagram. A search through decades of records. A review of forgotten cases. An attempt to separate fact from possibility. Because after discovering that Peter Tobin's known crimes stretched back further than anyone expected, detectives had to confront the most difficult question of all. Where did his story really begin? The discovery of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol's remains changed the nature of the investigation forever. Before that moment, Peter Tobin was a convicted murderer whose crime against Angelica Cluck had shocked Scotland. After the discovery in Margate, investigators were forced to look at a much larger and more disturbing possibility. Peter Tobin's known criminal history might not represent the full extent of his actions. The question was no longer only what happened to Angelica Cluck. The question became, how many lives had crossed paths with Peter Tobin during the decades before investigators finally identified him as a murderer? For detectives, this was not a question answered by instinct or fear. It was answered through reconstruction. They had to examine a life that had unfolded across more than 40 years. Every address, every workplace, every period of time where his movements could be established. Every location where a person connected to an unresolved case might have encountered him. The scale of the task was enormous. A single homicide investigation can involve thousands of pieces of information. Operation Anagram required investigators to examine a suspected offender's entire documented history across multiple police areas and multiple decades. The challenge was not only finding information. It was deciding what information mattered. When detectives examine possible serial offending, they often look for repeated patterns. Victim characteristics, geographical behavior, methods of approach, periods of activity, changes in lifestyle. These patterns can sometimes reveal connections between crimes that initially appear unrelated. However, real investigations are rarely simple. Human behavior does not always follow a predictable formula. An offender may change locations. A victim may not fit previous patterns. Evidence may be missing. A crime may remain hidden for years before anyone understands its significance. For Operation Anagram, investigators approached the past with caution. They were aware that Peter Tobin's confirmed crimes involved young women, but they could not assume every missing woman from the same period was connected to him. The investigation had to remain focused on evidence. That meant examining possibilities while accepting that many would not lead to conclusions. One of the most significant challenges was the passage of time. Decades can transform a crime scene beyond recognition. A building may be demolished. A road may be redesigned. A neighborhood may change completely. People who once lived nearby may have moved away or passed on. Records that seemed unimportant at the time may become difficult to locate. Even memories become complicated. A person who witnessed something unusual 20 or 30 years earlier may remember the general impression but not the exact details. Investigators must carefully evaluate such information, understanding both its potential value and its limitations. The passage of time creates uncertainty. But it does not erase the possibility of truth. This belief drove Operation Anagram. As the investigation expanded, police examined numerous unresolved cases and compared them against Tobin's known history. The process involved reviewing missing person reports, historical investigations, and information from different police forces. Some cases appeared worth examining because of similarities. Perhaps Tobin had lived nearby. Perhaps the timing overlapped. Perhaps there was a connection between locations. But many possible links ended there. A coincidence. Nothing more. This was one of the most important realities of the operation. A suspect can appear connected to many events simply because they lived a long life across many places. The longer someone's history, the more coincidences investigators will naturally find. The responsibility of detectives was to determine which connections were meaningful. The public attention surrounding Operation Anagram created another challenge. Outside the investigation, speculation grew rapidly. The idea that Peter Tobin might have been responsible for numerous additional crimes captured public imagination. The possibility of an unidentified serial killer operating for decades created fear and fascination. But investigators worked differently. They could not build cases based on public belief. They could not treat rumors as evidence. They could not allow pressure for answers to influence the standards required for justice. Every possible victim deserved more than speculation. Every family deserved the truth, not assumptions. This approach sometimes meant disappointing conclusions. A case might be investigated extensively and still remain unresolved. A theory might appear convincing but fail to meet the legal standard required for prosecution. For detectives, Accepting uncertainty was part of the job. The investigation also brought attention to another long-standing mystery, the identity of the offender known as Bible John. The murders attributed to Bible John had remained one of Scotland's most famous unsolved cases since the late 1960s. Because Peter Tobin had lived in Glasgow during that era, some people questioned whether he might have been responsible. The possibility was examined. Investigators considered the available information, compared timelines, and reviewed similarities and differences. But despite public interest and speculation, no evidence emerged that could conclusively identify Tobin as Bible John. The theory remained unproven. This was a recurring theme throughout Operation Anagram. Possibility was everywhere. Proof was much harder to find. The deeper investigators looked into Peter Tobin's past, the more they encountered the same difficult reality. They were examining not only crimes. They were examining lost opportunities. Questions about whether earlier warning signs had been recognized. Questions about whether information had been shared effectively. Questions about how someone with a known history of serious offending continued moving through communities. These questions were uncomfortable but important. Every major criminal investigation creates an opportunity to understand how future cases might be handled differently. Operation Anagram became more than a search for additional victims. It became an examination of how a dangerous offender could remain hidden for so long. Despite the uncertainty surrounding possible additional crimes, 3 victims remained at the center of what investigators could prove. Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, Dinah McNichol. Their cases represented the evidence-based foundation of the investigation. 3 women. 3 families. 3 stories connected through a man whose criminal history had taken years to fully uncover. For their families, the investigation brought answers that had been impossible for years. But for investigators, those answers created new questions. Because when a person responsible for multiple murders is finally identified, there is always a possibility that other victims remain unknown. That possibility is what drove Operation Anagram forward. Not certainty. Not assumption. But responsibility. The responsibility to look deeper. To examine every reasonable possibility. To search for those who might otherwise remain forgotten. And to ensure that if another victim existed, their story would not disappear into the silence of history. The investigation had moved beyond one crime scene, beyond one city, and beyond one year. It had become a journey through decades of unanswered questions. A search through the hidden chapters of Peter Tobin's life. And the further detectives looked, the more they realized that the greatest mystery was no longer what he had done. It was how much remained unknown. The most significant turning point in the investigation into Peter Tobin did not come from a dramatic confession. It did not come from a witness suddenly remembering a crucial detail. It came from a place that, for years, had appeared completely ordinary. A garden. A piece of ground behind a house in Margate. A place where seasons had changed, where rain had fallen, where plants had grown, and where daily life had continued above secrets hidden beneath the surface. When investigators first began searching the property connected to Peter Tobin after his arrest for the murder of Angelica Cluck, they were looking for evidence related to one crime. They were not expecting to uncover a connection to 2 missing person cases that had haunted families for more than 15 years. But that is exactly what happened. The discovery would transform the entire investigation. It would change how police viewed Peter Tobin. It would lead to the creation of one of the most extensive reviews of a suspected serial offender ever conducted in Britain. And it would finally provide answers to families who had spent years living with uncertainty. The property in Margate had become a focus of investigators because of Tobin's connection to it. At the time, police were already aware that Tobin's background required careful examination. His history of serious offending meant that detectives could not approach the case as a simple isolated incident. They had to consider the possibility that there might be more evidence connected to his past. This is a common challenge in major investigations. A crime scene is not always limited to the location where a victim is found. Sometimes, answers exist somewhere else. A previous address. A forgotten storage area. A place connected to the suspect years earlier. Investigators therefore examined locations associated with Tobin's history, searching for information that could clarify what had happened and whether his known crimes extended beyond Angelica Cluck's murder. The Margate property became one of those locations. At first, it was simply another place connected to the suspect. Then the ground revealed something that nobody expected. Human remains were discovered. The significance of that moment was immediate. A search connected to one murder investigation had uncovered evidence of another tragedy. The investigation had suddenly expanded across time. For detectives, discovering human remains is never simply about identifying a body. It is about restoring a story. A set of remains represents someone who had a life before they became evidence. Someone had once waited for them to come home. Someone had searched for them. Someone had kept photographs. Someone had wondered, year after year, what had happened. The discovery created a connection between the property and two long unsolved disappearances. The remains were later identified as belonging to Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. For their families, the news brought a painful kind of certainty. After years of searching, after years of unanswered questions, they finally knew what had happened. But the truth was devastating. The disappearance of a loved one carries uncertainty. A family may imagine countless possibilities. A person may have left voluntarily. A person may have lost contact. A person may still return. The discovery of remains removes that uncertainty forever. It provides answers. But those answers can be unbearable. The discovery also forced investigators to reconsider the timeline of Peter Tobin's offending. Before this point, the focus had been on events surrounding Angelica Cluck's disappearance in 2006. Now, detectives were looking back 15 years earlier. The investigation had moved from a single crime to a possible pattern. This was the moment when the idea of Operation Anagram began to take shape. The question facing police was enormous. If Peter Tobin was responsible for murders in 1991 and 2006, could there be other victims? To answer that question, investigators needed to understand his entire history. Not just the years surrounding the known murders. His entire adult life. The search of the Margate property also demonstrated the importance of advances in forensic investigation. A location that had once appeared ordinary could become significant when examined with modern methods and a new understanding of the person connected to it. Forensic specialists carefully documented the site. Every piece of information mattered. The position of remains. The condition of the surrounding area. The relationship between physical evidence and historical records. The work required patience and precision. A forensic investigation is not simply a search for confirmation. It is a process of reconstructing events. Determining what happened. Determining when it happened. Determining whether the evidence supports a criminal case. In historical investigations, this process becomes even more complex because time has already altered the environment. The discovery at Margate changed public perception of Peter Tobin. Before it happened, many people knew him only because of the investigation into Angelica Cluck's murder. Afterward, he became associated with a much wider question. Had he been committing crimes for years? The possibility captured public attention. It also created enormous pressure on investigators. Every unresolved disappearance connected to Tobin's timeline became a potential avenue of investigation. Every previous address became significant. Every missing person case required careful review. But detectives knew they had to move carefully. The discovery of 2 additional victims did not mean every unsolved case could be linked to Tobin. It meant the possibility had to be examined. That distinction would guide Operation Anagram. For the families of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, the discovery represented the end of a long and painful chapter. Vicky had disappeared as a 15-year-old girl. Dinah had disappeared at 18. Their families had lived through years of unanswered questions, never knowing whether they would receive the truth. The investigation into Peter Tobin finally answered the question that had remained unresolved for so long. But it also revealed the terrible reality behind their disappearances. They had not simply vanished. They had been victims. The discovery at Margate became the foundation of a much larger investigation. A garden that had once been just another location in a long list of addresses connected to Peter Tobin became the place where decades of uncertainty began to unravel. It demonstrated one of the most important truths in criminal investigation. The past does not disappear. Evidence can remain hidden. Stories can remain unfinished. But sometimes, years later, a discovery can bring the truth back into view. For Peter Tobin, the investigation that began with Angelica Cluck's murder had now revealed something far more disturbing. His known crimes stretched across 15 years. His movements stretched across decades. And investigators were now faced with the possibility that beneath the surface of his history, more unanswered stories were waiting to be uncovered. The discovery of the remains at the Margate property did more than solve two long-standing missing person cases. It fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Until that point, detectives had been building a case around the murder of Angelica Cluck. Their attention had naturally focused on Glasgow, on the events of September 2006, and on the evidence linking Peter Tobin to that crime. The investigation was already substantial, but its scope remained relatively clear. The discoveries in Margate altered that perspective completely. Investigators were no longer examining a single sequence of events. They were now looking at the possibility that crimes committed years apart, in different regions of Britain, might be connected by the same offender. That realization carried practical consequences. If two victims who had disappeared in 1991 were found at a property associated with Tobin, detectives had to ask whether other locations connected to his past also required renewed attention. Every confirmed address became relevant. Every period of residence had to be placed on a timeline. Every move between towns and cities had to be documented as accurately as possible. The work was methodical rather than dramatic. Officers assembled records from multiple police forces, local authorities, correctional institutions, and public archives. Historical tenancy information, electoral records, employment details, and other official documents helped establish where Tobin had lived and when those periods of residence began and ended. Where documentation was incomplete, investigators sought corroboration from additional sources rather than relying on a single record. This process reflected a basic principle of major investigations: conclusions must rest on verified information. As the timeline became more detailed, investigators compared it with unresolved cases from the same periods. Their purpose was not to prove that every disappearance was connected to Tobin. Instead, they sought to determine whether there were cases that warranted renewed investigation because the available evidence justified further review. In many instances, the answer was no. Some disappearances occurred when Tobin was documented elsewhere. Other cases involved circumstances that differed substantially from the confirmed murders. Additional inquiries produced no evidence connecting him to the victims. These outcomes were important. Eliminating unsupported possibilities allowed investigators to concentrate resources on cases where meaningful investigative opportunities remained. The review also demonstrated the complexity of historical investigations. Records created decades earlier were often never intended to be examined alongside materials from entirely different jurisdictions. Detectives therefore had to reconcile differences in reporting practices, terminology, and archival systems. A seemingly minor discrepancy in dates or addresses could affect whether a potential connection remained plausible or could be confidently excluded. Alongside documentary review, investigators re-examined physical evidence where appropriate. Advances in forensic science had created opportunities unavailable when many of the original investigations took place. Evidence preserved for years could sometimes be analyzed using more sensitive techniques, although the usefulness of such material depended heavily on its condition and the circumstances in which it had been collected. The investigation also relied on interviews. Some individuals who had known Tobin were approached again after many years. Others had never previously been interviewed because their relevance had not been apparent during earlier investigations. Detectives asked about periods of residence, employment, relationships, and everyday routines. These conversations were conducted with the understanding that memories fade over time and that recollections must be assessed alongside documentary evidence whenever possible. For many witnesses, the passage of years made precise details difficult to recall. Dates became uncertain. Sequences of events blurred together. Investigators therefore avoided placing undue weight on memory alone. Instead, witness accounts were used to supplement, clarify, or challenge information already established through records. As more information was assembled, it became increasingly clear that Operation Anagram would require extensive coordination. Different police forces held different pieces of the overall picture. Analysts, forensic specialists, intelligence officers, and homicide investigators all contributed to the review. The inquiry evolved into one of the largest investigations ever conducted in Britain into the historical activities of a single convicted offender. Despite its scale, the investigation maintained a consistent objective: determine what could be established through evidence. Not every question produced an answer. Not every theory survived examination. Some leads that initially appeared promising ultimately proved unrelated after timelines were verified. Others remained unresolved because available evidence was insufficient to reach a reliable conclusion. This willingness to distinguish between established fact and unresolved possibility became one of the defining features of Operation Anagram. The investigation also highlighted a broader lesson about criminal inquiries extending across many years. Individual cases are often investigated within the context available at the time they occur. Only later, when new evidence emerges, can investigators recognize links that were previously impossible to identify. The connection between the murders of Angelica Cluck, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNichol illustrates how separate investigations, conducted years apart, may eventually converge through new forensic findings and renewed review of historical records. By this stage, detectives had moved far beyond the original crime scene in Glasgow. The investigation had become an extensive examination of Peter Tobin's documented life, testing whether additional crimes could be supported by evidence rather than speculation. The discoveries in Margate had demonstrated that important answers could remain hidden for many years. The challenge now was determining whether those discoveries represented the full extent of the truth or whether further evidence remained to be found elsewhere in the long and carefully reconstructed history of Peter Tobin.